Welcome back to TENE at Night. I'm Fritz McLinden, for all you night owls out there, joined as usual by Boris and Ray.
Yo.
Hey.
Late night for us tonight. This is our latest episode, I think, ever, recording-wise.
Is it?
I don't think we've ever started recording at like 1:30 before.
I think we did.
I'm feeling it. You think
I feel like we've done it once before, yeah.
All right. Well, I like our little slumber party nights.
Yeah. Well, we've been kidnapped and taken to another location. For those of you that are maybe wondering why, for example, there was a little bit of a break there with some episodes. If you are a Patreon subscriber, you will know that we went through some epic battles and were beaten and kidnapped and woke up in strange places and had to fight strange characters. And
here we are.
Now we're regrouping at night to
that's right,
on a counteroffensive.
Exactly right. Yeah,
to finish up this arc.
Unfortunately, what even our Patreon listeners don't know is that in the end, Ray's brain was ultimately defeated by Ezra Pound.
Absolutely, yes.
Just broke it right in half.
Yeah. I mean, it's my fault that this is like, that we're late so much with this episode. So this is our basically final episode in this arc. I mean, before the wrap-up episode.
Yeah.
And it is our fourth Ezra Pound episode, right?
Ooh, well, what are we counting? Because we had his Virgins on Guard episode. And that
was the third one, and this is the fourth.
But we also did his radio propaganda.
Yes.
So this would be the fifth.
Oh, you're right.
Shit.
Yes, the fifth.
Yeah. He's a record holder, I think.
Yeah, that's too much.
Mm-hmm.
Entirely.
That's what happened to your brain there.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. It was really hard. This was the hardest thing for me to do. I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe you can tell me afterwards what you think. Maybe we can see this episode as a kind of a therapy. You can explain to me why this was so hard to me.
Ray's too cheap to pay for therapy, so listeners, patrons, whoever, help us out.
No, I was thinking two of you.
Oh, no, you're fucked then.
So, I don't know. I mean, part of it is definitely that, I mean, this arc is like really very long, and I'm sick of American fascists for the time being.
Yeah.
And I would like to talk about something else. And also Pound, we did too much about him. I mean, it's very relevant to the arc and to our entire podcast, so we had to do that. Had to talk about him. But I don't know, it was... So I read for this episode, I read a book by Alec Marsh, who was the person who was kind enough to send us the Virginians on Guard pamphlet, who is like a Ezra Pound scholar. And he wrote a book called John Kasper and Ezra Pound, Saving the Republic. It was published in 2015. And it's a very interesting book and very relevant to the things we were talking about in this arc. Like, especially to, when we were much younger and more naive, when we did the episode that we thought was in the middle of this arc.
That was those times, yeah.
The
good old days.
Some things that we talked about in that, recap episode are very, connected to the topics discussed in this book. Are generally about how America is fucked up. But yeah, I don't know. It's a very good book. It's very interesting and very relevant for us. And it was easy for me to read it. But when it was time for me to somehow absorb it, write notes, and prepare the episode, this was very, very hard for me for some reason. I don't know. Well, so this is the result of it. It will not be the best episode we did. But,
what a way to start an episode.
Yeah.
Just by saying that, I feel like it kind of might be the best. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually when we think something is crap, it turns out to be better than we thought. But
yeah, but we're usually really drunk.
Yeah.
When that happens.
I also tried to get drunk now, and I couldn't. I'm too fucked up on Pound to get drunk. I don't know. So we talked about Ezra Pound and how much of horrible fascist and anti-Semite and Nazi he was
Yeah.
during the Second World War. And this episode will deal with the post-war period.
Which we touched on a little bit in
Yeah.
the Patreon episode, Virgins on Guard.
Yes.
Yeah. So now we'll, I guess, go through some of the background.
We'll set the context for that episode and that pamphlet that he and John Kasper wrote. So specifically, this deals with his so-called St. Elizabeth's period, which is the name of the mental hospital where he was kept.
It's a very
Washington.
nice way to put that period.
Yes, that's how they call it.
Yes.
St. Elizabeth's period.
The Elizabethan era.
Yes, which lasted from 1945 until 1958. So it's not even, we are not really even done with him. I mean, there are probably will come back, unfortunately, to Ezra Pound sometime in the future. Because he continued to be a horrible person even after this. Because I think he died in 72 or something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And went back to Italy. But Alec Marsh says that this period, which is often overlooked, was one of his most productive periods in terms of amount of poetry that he wrote and so on. But he was also very politically active. So, we discussed how he was like a propagandist for fascist Italy, and then didn't, as most Italian fascists kind of gave up on Mussolini in 1943. Ezra Pound didn't, and he went up north and continued, continued to be a propagandist of the more Nazi-aligned Italian fascist state, the Republic of Salò, which and really enforced the Holocaust there, and then somehow managed to stay alive after that and be sentenced to this indefinite stay in a mental hospital, but he kept on being politically active, very much so in that period. So this is 1950s, United States. So you can imagine what we are going to talk about. And it's even in a way more depressive than his, Italian period. And I would say almost I think it's more right wing than that period, which is very interesting, I think.
Well, because I think we touched on this in that Patreon episode, but for those that didn't get to listen to it, I mean, there is this kind of phenomenon in which he considered himself to be on the left wing of the fascist movement in Italy, but then when you get to some of his positions in the U.S., they're so far right on so far on the American right and so incredibly racist. That that his kind of idea of being this left-wing fascist is
well, I mean, okay, so this is
it's still a left-wing fascist, but incredibly racist in the American context.
Yes, I mean, these are all very relative terms. So for him, a left-wing fascist also meant wanting to exterminate the Jews much more than the other Italian fascists, because he saw that as class war. It's a war against the bankers. So that also, in his eyes, made him more left-wing than the not so insanely anti-Semitic Italian fascists.
Right.
So, for example, that. But yes, there were other things as well that he talked about capitalism and so on. And he even, as we mentioned, recommended for the Salò Republic to publish some works of Lenin and Marx and so on, because he saw some value in them. And so on. But now in the American context, he's he's a fanatical supporter of McCarthy, and using the term left is like a slur for him and his people around him. And this is what they apply to basically other extreme American right-wing people who they think are not enough right-wing. So they call them lefty. So it's a very, it's crazy, but in some sense, it's like a more right-wing environment than fascist in Italy. I mean, it's at least, well, okay.
A lot more enthusiastic about anti-miscegenation work.
Yeah.
Than the typical Italian fascist might have been.
Yeah. Yes. So, of course, his political activity in this period was not overt. He, because he was, of course, afraid
institutionalized.
getting executed, basically, or never let go out of the mental hospital. But still, he was very active. He wrote a lot of anonymous texts, or texts that were published under the names of his, disciples. So what we find out by reading this book is that he was like an influential figure in the American extreme right wing of the 1950s. Basically, Marsh calls his group of disciples, he calls them the Saint Elizabeth Circle. So there are people who would visit Pound there, and they were basically a faction inside of the American fascism of 1950s. So and you can see clearly how Pound, through his disciples, was connected almost basically to all of the currents that we mentioned so far of American fascism that were active in that period. So one of his closest collaborators was a guy that we mentioned before called Eustis Mullins. At the time, he was the member of the National Renaissance Party. So he wrote, and we said when we first mentioned him, I think it was one of the Yoki episodes, we mentioned him as the National Renaissance Party, expert on the Federal Reserve System. So he had a status because he wrote a book about that topic, and he wrote it under the guidance of Ezra Pound, and mostly influenced by basically Ezra Pound was a mentor in writing that book, and influenced the National Renaissance Party through that, among other things. So his disciples were very active in the 1950s extreme right wing of the United States. Some continue to be active long after that. I mean, Mullins died in 2010, and he was active until he died.
One of those.
He was active on the internet, mostly as an anti-Semite. That was his field. There were lots of different groups who were in contact with Pound. We won't talk about most of them. We'll focus on John Kasper, but just to mention, through a guy called David Horton, Ezra Pound was in contact with a guy that we mentioned before called General Pedro del Valle.
Oh, yeah.
So he was in close contact with him. He was a head of a right-wing group called Defenders of the American Constitution. And this faction of his, let's say, disciples was closely connected with the Minutemen and later with the militia movement. General Pedro del Valle was also a friend of George Lincoln Rockwell, and he was in correspondence with him. So there's that. But the most important and the closest of the American followers of Ezra Pound in this period was a guy called John Kasper. So Casper was born in 1929 in Camden, New Jersey, and he was raised in a militantly anti-communist Presbyterian church, led by a guy called Carl McIntyre. Now, what distinguished Casper from the other Pound's disciples from this period was that Casper was a kind of, unlike them, also capable of inspiring others and having his own followers. So he was a kind of a leader, unlike most of the others. Because it's very interesting, because these people are, they consider themselves the elite and so on, but they are in the strain of American fascism that was probably cruder in their racism than the American Nazi Party. And some of the fascists say they were. We when we talked about the Minutemen, we talked briefly about that guy called Robert N. Taylor, and he talked about this faction of people because later they reorganized themselves as the so-called National States' Rights Party. So these are John Kasper's people, and Robert N. Taylor said, I met those who was one of the leaders of the Minutemen. And he said, I met those people, and they were their stuff was so crude, it was worse than the American Nazi Party stuff.
I mean, that says a lot too, given that really the American Nazi Party, we've talked about them in our previous episodes, but I mean, they did the whole Hate Nanny music tour where it was just racial slurs and country music and stuff like that. I mean, you have to try pretty hard to be more like.
I mean, they were
crude
brain-dead
and extreme.
lunatics.
Yeah,
Like-
yeah. I mean, that says a lot. It says a
Yes,
lot
it
for
really
the kind
does.
of person that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
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 I mean, this is like a level of. Okay, we read and have a whole fucking episode about their pamphlet called Virginians on Guard.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like that level of, this is like direct precursor to Atomwaffen division or something like that.
Yeah.
And but with much better political connections, as we'll see. And also possibly that pamphlet was printed in a very interesting place.
Okay.
Like you'll see.
Okay.
Oh man.
So Casper encountered Pound while he was like a 21-year-old student at the Columbia University. He studied, I think, philosophy and English. And he started corresponding with Pound as a fan, basically, fan of his poetry. And this remained their main way of communication throughout their contact together, which ended in 1963. They met often. Casper would go and visit Pound in the hospital, but they primarily corresponded. And between 1950 and 1963, Casper sent more than 400 letters to Pound and received an unknown number of replies, because Pound letters are lost, probably deliberately so, because, James Casper was a terrorist.
Right.
So it's interesting, because all of this politics is centered around American South, and neither John Kasper nor Ezra Pound were people from the South. I mean, Casper was from New Jersey.
Right.
But they're completely obsessed with the question of, segregation and integration and the civil rights movement in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And focused on the South.
Let's just clarify also that they had a really major impact on that as well. I mean, they weren't just some sort of
absolutely
small minor group. I mean, they did the first terrorisms against the first schools that desegregated, and
they had a direct influence on postponing segregation probably for a few years.
Yeah,
at least desegregation, and this is
the White Citizens Councils they were called.
Yes. And directly, John Kasper, under the guidance of Ezra Pound, had that impact in the South.
Yeah,
and not to mention the horrible way this is just these people are just the worst. This is what they did there. It's on some level they did things that Atomwaffen fantasy is about.
Yeah.
Except they did stick very deeply into the political sphere. It wasn't exclusively nihilistic violence.
No,
but they moved an enormous amount of power around, though.
Yeah, yes.
They defined that face you see that everybody looks at now and shows in school and says, "Weren't they so stupid back then?" That face is the face you should be thinking of right now. That sort of vicious and violent, angry white guy yelling at children. That's our boy Ezra.
Yeah.
Yes. People who saw themselves as some kind of heroes by basically terrorizing small children.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's completely disgusting. And so Pound had this southern orientation in his so-called Jeffersonian, or maybe not so-called, politics. I think Alec Marsh sometimes called his politics as Jeffersonian fascism, something like this. But anyway, this is a very pro-agrarian in theory, politics, which sees an independent producer as the model of citizenship.
Yeah, quite the farmer, that Pound.
Yeah, of course.
Spent all his time in the fields.
Yes, we'll talk about that. It's So
and all those that white Southern society that they venerate so much is also so much based on the hard work of those white men out in the fields.
No, but that's exactly. They're quite open about who is the farmer. It's an agrarian society. It doesn't mean the white people are the farmers.
Oh, I see.
So,
yes. Always ask follow-up questions.
Yes. So, it is also an ideology that's, sees history as a class struggle, but this is a class struggle between producers, which includes workers and like small capitalists or owners of productive capital, and on other side, bankers and financiers, Jews. So this is like a very vicious ideology, like one of the worst that you can imagine, because it allows you to basically see the Holocaust as a
class war. Yeah.
Class war, yeah. I mean, and that's how he saw it. So a major trigger for this phase of American racism was the Brown decision of the Supreme Court in 1954. This was the decision that started the process of integration in the schools in the South, and this is really what mobilized all of these people. And
just to also remind listeners, I mean, Brown versus the Board of Education has come up so many times in this arc. I mean, if we had a search feature, God knows how many times it would show up. But I mean, I'm sure to the seasoned listener, this isn't your first time hearing about this Supreme Court decision, of course.
So this was also the time when they started to frame their racism as an issue of state rights and just an issue of American federalism. All these principles. It's about principles.
I'm from Texas. I know.
Yeah. So Pound and Casper and all of these people were very much into that thing. And placed that politics in the center of their activity. So they were also Marsh writes about the evolution of Pound's racism. We'll touch on about a little bit on that. It was too much for me to have a detailed discussion on that, how he became an even worse racist. But he did because in the beginning he was more kind of a cultural anti-Semite. And then probably starting in 1942, when he read Mein Kampf in the Italian translation, he became like a biological pro-eugenics kind of anti-Semite and racist, and continued to be that and became even worse in that sense in 1950s America. So one statement from him is each race has its own qualities. Any attempt to obscure racial character is anti-scientific. No race can fully perform the function of another. This also, touches on the question of what is this agrarian society about. So in the 1950s, he actually became very influenced by so-called scientific racism of a guy called Louis Agassiz, who's a Swiss 19th century Swiss biologist and horrible asshole who developed
it's a long business card.
Yeah, just horrible quasi-scientific racist theory. Agassiz was also he also rejected Darwinian evolution and basically believed in something that today would be called intelligent design. And Pound was also his follower in that sphere as well. He was also pro-intelligent design against.
Just picking winners all the way down.
Yeah.
So they believed or said that they believed that the Civil War, Casper Pound group, that the Civil War was entirely, or as Pound calls it, the Secession War, was about the issue of state rights, the principle of sovereignty of states.
Right.
And that the issue of slavery was secondary, which is also shows their incredible racism. That they say, it was about principles. It wasn't about some people being slaves,
the principle of human property, which is
the principle of state rights, which is higher than the
to
principle
own
of
human property.
Yes.
This is a trip. I just now remembered my civics teacher's name for the first time in 20 years when you said that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just all flooding back. The fucking motorcycle helmet on the desk, all of it.
So, so the Civil War was about state rights, and today, the new struggle is also about state rights, and it's about not allowing small children to go to school with white children.
It's the liberty to determine that you want your kids to not go to school with black people.
Yes. So Pound is very active in this, behind the scenes in his struggle to in efforts against the enforcement of the Brown versus Board of Education decision of the Supreme Court. And Casper, his faithful disciple, but you will not believe how much Casper was like Pound's sycophant. It's disgusting.
Okay, so what Pound was to Mussolini, Casper is to Pound.
Yes, except Mussolini probably didn't know anything about Pound, and
right?
Casper was in touch with Pound.
Yeah,
he's a literal fanboy.
Back.
Yeah. He's a literal fanboy, in the worst way possible.
Yes.
And Casper was one of the most active agitators in this struggle. And together with Pound, he authored the horrible pamphlet that we have a whole episode about, called The Virginians on Guard. And the goal of that pamphlet was to encourage massive resistance to integration.
Oh, I thought the goal of it was to make us all insane.
Yeah.
Well,
no, the goal of it was to have liberty to decide, to choose. Choice is important, Fritz. Ray, you know that you have the right to choose, okay? Yeah. It's liberty.
Of course.
This is the issue. Okay?
So, although, Pound was became a biological racist in 1942, he had lots of background. We know that he was an anti-Semite. I mean, most of his life, at least the one that we covered, which is we started covering his activities before the First World War, and he was already had some anti-Semitic ideas back then. But he also has his family background gave him a lot of foundation for his horrible racism. For example, his father, Homer Pound,
okay,
which I guess they thought would sound distinguished, but now it sounds. So
Marge is the Jews. I can't do it.
Yes. He wrote in his memoir about Homer wrote in his memoir about the Civil War, and he called it a blot on the pages of our national life because it was a war between a people of the same nation and of white blood over an abstract issue not worth the cost of white lives. So, so he was...
the slavery of black people.
Yeah, it's an abstract issue because, it's an issue about property. Christ. And, yes. Ezra Pound saw the defeat of the South as well as the Axis powers in the Second World War as incidents in the same sequence as Alec Marsh phrased it. So these were two phases in the war of creditors against debtors, of usury against productive capital.
Usury!
Yeah. So it's interesting that, especially in this pre-biological, pre-Nazi era, just horrible racist era of Ezra Pound, he often, he would see African Americans as true Americans. He was one of these very Anglo-Saxon Americans, before the American Nazi Party opened, racism towards including other white people in it. He very much insists on Anglo-Saxon stuff,
right?
And he sees Anglo-Saxons as true Americans, but on the other hand, he also sees black people as true Americans, more so than other groups, but in their role as farmers or as agrarian workers, which is something that's their racial destiny to be. And Anglo-Saxon's destiny is to be the legislator, to be the ruler, and these are the farmers, slaves, workers, however you want to frame it.
This is a very traditional American concept of racial hierarchy and stuff.
Yes.
I mean that you see even come down into sports and the like.
But it also
the quarterback is a white guy because he makes the decisions and blah, blah, blah.
It also harkens back to oh my god, the fucking movie. The name has just escaped my mind. It's so late. The big silent film about the racist Batman that invents the KKK.
Oh my God, did we cover that?
Yes.
Is that something we talked about?
It's a silent film. It's like 4 hours long, and it's called Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation?
Yes.
I was fucking with you there a little bit.
Oh, man. My brain. This Morlock stuff here is good. But it's like the beginning of Birth of a Nation when all the slaves are happy, and dancing around. They're petting puppies for an hour,
Yes. So the Pound had his own group, in the 1950s fascist scene in America, and they were like to the right of the most rightists of America at the time. So, for example, they were to the right of the John Birch Society, because the Jewish question was too central to their worldview, so they were not able to sublimate it into the more accepted idea of a communist conspiracy like the John Birch Society did.
Right. I mean, and we see this, we've seen this with a bunch of groups too that split off from the John Birch Society. I mean,
right.
Klansman calling the Birchers kosher conservatives.
Oh, man. No, I mean, like half of our episodes are like that.
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
being to the right of the John Birch Society no longer impresses me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is okay. So it's interesting. In this book, I found out that you remember a guy who was called Lees? What was his first name?
Arnold? No.
Arnold Lees. Yes, you're right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Damn.
So he was a British guy who was the leader of the Imperial Fascist League.
Why do I remember that and not Birth of a Nation?
I don't know. You're fucked.
I'm fucked.
So Arnold Lees was basically a British Nazi, kind of a dissident of the Oswald Mosley's fascist movement, who called, in 1930s, he called Oswald Mosley kosher fascist.
Yeah.
And he was like all about, killing Jews. And he became the mentor. I think we said that in our first episode.
I think so. Yeah.
He was the mentor of Colin Jordan, who was the mentor of David Mamet, and so on.
Right.
He corresponded with Ezra Pound in 1930s.
Damn. Okay.
And at the time, like when he went to prison in Britain because he wrote about blood libel, and stuff like that, and very much insisted on it. And he was actually, Lees was friends with Julius Streicher, who was the editor of the Der Stürmer, the worst Nazi paper, like the most crude, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic Nazi paper, like the worst Nazi paper of 1930s.
Yeah.
That's quite an award to get.
Yeah.
Guys.
Some serious contenders there.
I want to thank my dad for being so abusive. I think was Lees not also the one that was tied to British intelligence?
I think some of his followers were later leaders of the Column 88, I think, or like collaborators of his.
Okay.
But probably he was as well. I don't know. But like when they corresponded in 1930s, they would together, Ezra Pound and Arnold Lees would call Oswald Mosley, kosher Nazi, or they would call him Pound. When he wrote to Lees, he would call Mosley like Moses Levy or something like that.
Wow.
Ouch.
Yeah. But Pound remained friends with Oswald Mosley until he died, like until the 70s. I think he died in 72, and he was like collaborating with him after he was released from the mental hospital and lived in Italy. In 1960s, Ezra Pound was attending a fascist meeting in 1960s in Rome, and he introduced Oswald Mosley there as a speaker.
God damn.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
I could just picture Ginsburg writing to him being like, don't you know we rehabilitated you?
Yes.
Political rehabilitation. You went to mental hospital.
Yes. Okay. This is going to be a long. I'm trying to cut it, but
we appreciate it.
Hey, I mean, we're here already, so
I'm feeling good actually.
As they said, buy the ticket, take the ride. You know what I mean? We're
these pages are not turning that fast.
Hey,
as much
you know what they say? In for a penny, in for a pound.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's what they say.
Okay. So Also, what's different about Pound in American fascism up to that point was that all of American fascists were Christians. Like even the more esoteric ones, like silver shirts and so on, who Pound was also in contact with in the 1930s, were Christian. But Pound wasn't. He wasn't because he thought that Christianity was too Jewish. It was like contaminated by Judaism.
Magian.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So Casper probably also wasn't, like, he had a Christian background, like fundamentalist in his family, and he sometimes used Christianity in some sense, but probably, I mean, he was such a sycophant of Pound that he probably also wasn't a Christian.
Well, I mean, Casper was like a klansman too,
yeah.
but that utilizes Christianity in a very specific way. I mean,
he utilized Christianity like to exclude Jews from his like white citizens council group. Like his group, when he founded it, was more extreme the usual white citizens council group, because it forbid Jews to be members, and he did that by demanding that all members should be white Christians. Like so that was how they didn't say Jews can't join, but it's a white Christian group.
Christian then being kind of more of like a sectarian identity and less than like a actual like religious one that people.
I think he used it just to exclude Jews, not because he was a Christian. Okay, so initially, when he contacted Pound, Casper wanted to write a PhD thesis about him, and this is like he was like just a piece of shit when he wrote to him, and he basically wanted guidance in his life from Pound in a very subservient way.
Daddy Pound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he called him, like, all of his followers called him Grandpa or Gramps when they wrote to him. And so...
Thank you, Granddaddy.
So when he wrote him, while still referring to him as Mr. Pound, this is before they met in person, then he was like Gramps and Granddad and so on. He told him to Pound that that during my 4 years as an undergraduate, you are the only teacher I have had, the only teacher in all caps. So I'm
call me Granddaddy.
Yes, he's like searching for guidance from Pound.
But it kind of sounds like Casper wasn't actually enrolled then, because that shouldn't be the case in a university.
Yeah, I mean, he actually was, I think.
Oh,
but see, he says, I'm willing to learn as many languages as you demand. And he did later try to...
This is sexy.
Yeah, he did try to learn Greek and Italian later. And study history thoroughly to learn calculus or how to make atomic bombs if necessary.
Oh.
Yes, do that. The last.
So he tells him he wants to tackle what you would like to have done. Like a detailed study of John Adams' Cantos, or Gazelle and Douglas, monetary theory, or like basically he's offering to Ezra Pound to write and to focus on whatever he wants him to do. And he tells him, like, you choose, and he's like extremely grateful for his attention or advice or anything.
It's like speak Italian to me, Granddaddy, and then like Ezra Pound starts like speaking in his like heavily American accented Italian that Italians had a hard time understanding. It's like, wow, you're so
Italiano.
Smart.
So he tells the Pound that he's a teacher of life. He's whole and complete, the embodiment of everything of value. I love you as you are just that to me.
And the attendants were wondering why Ezra was the only one who never requested pornography in his cell.
So when they, this contact and first meetings with Pound were...
Sorry, that's why it was so easy to like find all of Pound's letters, is because they're all kind of stuck together,
Oh!
Yeah. So, yeah, all of these meetings were, in Casper's words, of utmost importance for him, and this was like the, transformation they completely transformed his life from that point on. And he, when he became a part of the St. Elizabeth Circle, he met other people there as well, like that Dave Horton, who was in touch with the Minutemen, and also Eustis Mullins, who became his close collaborator through Ezra Pound. And they started making plans together at that point. So at first, Casper was involved in book publishing projects. So a few of these people, together with Casper, had this idea of publishing and distributing books that Ezra Pound recommended, because he had this text in which he recommended what books you should read and so on. So they were doing that, a lot of Confucius and stuff like that.
Well, I'm sure also his major political and economic masterpieces of his own,
of course,
certainly on there. Yeah.
And these people like all that we mentioned, social credit. This remains Ezra Pound's focus on his whole life.
He considered these things textbooks.
Yeah. Casper also used usury way more than the average person would.
Well, they straight up talked about, I think, social credit, right? In the
they did.
Thing.
Also, they were involved in organizing poetry groups in which they will read Ezra Pound's poetry, of course. But this was, it's very interesting because in a way, this is there's a lot of talk later on about groups like as the New Right in Europe, and their insistence of metapolitics, their right-wing reading of Gramsci and how culture is important and so on. And these people, as crude as they are, they have Ezra Pound, who is acknowledged as a great poet and so on.
Yeah.
And they use it in that way. They organize poetry groups. But discussing Ezra Pound's poetry also means that you discuss the monetary issue and his ideas about money. And that means that you discuss the Jewish communist conspiracy and so on. So they basically use poetry groups as a way to recruit people into Nazi stuff. So Eustis Mullins at the time, as we said, was engaged, involved with the National Renaissance Party. This is something that bothered Ezra Pound because not because he had any problem with their politics, but because they were kind of well-known, uniform Nazis, often in the media and so on, and he was scared that the journalists will make some connection between Ezra Pound and this group of, Nazis, and this will damage his attempts to be released from the hospital. And it's interesting that, a lot of these, followers from the same group were friends among each other, but they were also kind of in competition with each other. So, Casper would talk shit about Mullins when he was writing to Ezra Pound. How, Mullins is really using your name at, National Renaissance meetings. He's mentioning you a lot there, and so on. And this is bad for this and this reason, and so on. But when Mullins published his book about the Federal Reserve, it was sent, in agreement with Ezra Pound, it was sent to all of the leaders of American fascism and right wing at the time, including James Madole and so on. It was also sent to Oswald Mosley. Ezra Pound had his address. He was always in contact with him.
Mm-hmm.
But the center of Casper's activities in this period was a bookshop that he opened. And this was a bookshop which was called Make It New. And it was a kind of a Pandian bookshop. And it's interesting that he opened it in New York City, in Greenwich Village, actually, in 1953, October 1953. And Casper saw it. This is also the continuation of this kind of, as I said, meta-political activity, political activity through culture, as they saw it. So Casper saw this bookstore as a base for cultural operations, which also means, political operations. And it would only stock good books, which means books that, Gramps approved. And there was lots of these books that he approved, enough for a small bookstore, but also a place for meetings, poetry readings, Greek language classes, and so on. So it's interesting that, this is exactly how Casper framed it. And I think this goes into this, basically it's some kind of a crude definition of this, what later the European New Right called metapolitical activity. He said, eventually I hope enough serious people will come around to give the place an aura of respectability, enough to hold off the many violent passerby who want to break the windows of the bookstore. So you would have enough of intellectuals coming there and like poetry readings and so on that
to scare them off.
To have and it worked. It's interesting that it worked to some degree. Because it was like a very Poundian place, it also had a lot of classical music. These are also the people, that, as we said, who referred to rock and roll as so-called music and so on.
Right.
So they were very much into classical music, but no.
I mean, they wanted to outlaw it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Specifically, that is a point in Virginians on Guard for our free listeners who haven't heard that episode yet. They do not like rock and roll.
No. And they also do not like Beethoven. So there was no Beethoven there because he was
I get it. He's the rock star of classical music.
He was too Jewish in their opinion.
Sure.
Oh, okay. That's a new angle.
I never heard that before in my life.
On the old Ludwig van.
Yes.
So they made sure that always they have a Mein Kampf in their bookstore. Also, it's interesting that Casper wrote to Pound that although he had many, it was like a mess running that bookstore. He worked too much there, or didn't have time to sleep and so on. But he wrote to Pound that he was not looking for the help from the National Renaissance Party, as they are marked men, and so they would make it difficult for the bookstore to continue existing, and also because he said they were quite vulgar personally.
Which is funny because these guys are considered vulgar by other Nazis.
Right.
Yes. I mean, Casper at the time, he's a neo-Nazi. That's the way you can describe his politics. More so than in these early 50s, he's basically a neo-Nazi, more than a segregationist or just any kind of other fascist. He's into Pound and Hitler and stuff like that. But Casper had this idea, or he wrote to Pound about keeping Jews in the shop, which was by that he meant of having some Jewish authors there to camouflage the politics of the space. To be no, we're not Nazis. We have Jews here.
Yeah. To which he wrote back, do Catholics count?
Yeah, no, Pound was too stupid to realize the point that Casper was making. So he was very much against this because he thought that it will. How did he? It will infect. The bookshop will be infested by Jew rot. He said.
I was about to say this is kind of like but Death in June played in Israel argument.
Yes,
you know what I mean.
Yes, they anticipated a lot of these things. Casper did as well, but Pound, he was not visionary enough to.
Pound was too anti-Semitic for that shit.
Yes.
Pound was dumber than the Klan guy.
Yes. But what was interesting is that soon black nationalists started going to the bookstore, and Casper was fine with that. At the time, this was before he started framing his politics as Southern segregationist. He was just a Nazi from Jersey at the time. He was.
I think I know that song.
Yeah. He was okay with that. He got along fine with black nationalists who were coming there. So at the time, Casper was living a kind of a right-wing bohemian life in New York. He had a small flat that became a crash pad for a lot of these young, like-minded people. And as Alec Marsh says, all of them were unemployed, unstable, and unreliable. Most of them were drunks, and some even were heroin users.
Sweet, yeah, sounds familiar.
Yeah, and so one of his roommates at the time was Eustis Mullins, who was hanging out with his boy lovers all the time. He was into teenage boys. At one point, Casper writes to Pound while he was away from a very small flat. Eustis Mullins moved in a 70-year-old Nazi who was his boyfriend at the time. And
17-year-old Nazi.
Yeah. 17-year-old Nazi. Yeah.
Wow.
Casper had to kick. He said, "I had to kick out the stormtrooper out of the flat when I moved back because there was not enough space, like for 2 people, and let alone 3." And so Marsh, the author of this book that I'm reading, he speculates that the stormtrooper might have been Matt Cale, actually.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
But
okay.
he was of the right age at the time. And he is known to have had a close connection to Eustis Mullins. There was like rumors in Nazi scenes they were lovers,
Yeah.
whatever. They were later roommates and so on.
He also saw himself as like one of the smart ones.
Yes.
So it sounds like the right circle.
So yeah, he would have been like hanging out with these quasi-intellectual bohemian Nazis. And
No, we know that he did. Like when we did an episode on the New Order.
Yes, good Patreon
we
episode
mentioned
also.
how he said himself that he actually also went to St. Elizabeth's to see Pound. And loved him, and they had a nice conversation and so on. So yeah, and we know that he was a roommate of Eustis Mullins at some point. At some point, Casper writes to Pound how he has a good relationship with Eustis Mullins, but he's becoming impossibly decadent with his 2, 5, and 7 15-year-old boys he keeps around him.
Okay.
At the time, the FBI wrote about the bookstore in their file. It's a meeting place for Negro and Chinese homosexuals.
What? Wait, that's their conclusion of this this Nazi bookstore? Is that,
there is a Chinese connection. I'll mention it later.
It's a
but the problem with this Nazi bookstore is that Black and Chinese people go there.
Yes. It's
not that
not
that it's a Nazi bookstore. And that, like, these guys that run it are connected to Ezra Pound, who's currently hospitalized as like his quote unquote treatment for being a collaborator during World War II, and
entirely too enthusiastically. Yes.
Yeah.
No, the problem is that it's a gathering place for Black and Chinese people.
Homosexual ones.
Yes.
The old trifecta.
So, one of the Black people who apparently was also hanging out sometimes in the bookstore was the poet Amiri Baraka, at the time known as Leroy Jones. And he actually mentions Casper in one of his poems. He says something like, "Oh, I knew John Kasper when he hung out with shades." There's like this is a part of his poem.
Interesting.
Because all of these Nazis who were hanging out in Casper's flat and in the bookstore were just horribly incompetent drunk people. The most competent person that he collaborated with was like a young Black woman called Florette Henry at the time, and she and Casper became friends. And they went together to visit Ezra Pound, and Florette Henry corresponded with Ezra Pound later, and then she started working in the bookstore and basically was running the bookstore together with John Kasper.
Wow.
Because she was the most competent and reliable person that he could find at the time.
To run the white nationalist bookstore.
And Casper wrote to Pound about Florette Henry, and he wrote something like, "She digs the Yid question. She digs the communist stuff." And he's like using this like beatnik language at the time and so on.
I'm just happy to hear you use it.
Yes.
She digs that Yid jive. Yes.
Yes. So, as I mentioned before, this horrible 19th century Swiss racist Agassiz, it said, like, by Marsh, that he convinced Pound, or maybe he just made it easier for him to rationalize this belief that he already had before, that the people of African descent had different racial gifts. So they were predestined to be farmers, not legislators. Their racial destiny was basically to be subservient to the master races. So Pound was also, I think we mentioned before, he also believed that there were 2 master races. One were the Greeks, which means all Europeans somehow. I mean, he's crazy head.
Yes, right.
And the other were the Han Chinese people. They are also the master race, which is why there were some Chinese people in the bookstore. Or at least one guy, very weird guy.
It's also the only
enough
alien
for the
race.
FBI to just be like, yes, it's a gathering point. It's
It's
like
also-
one dude.
And if you all remember back to that Christian identity stuff, they're also the Chinese people are the only alien race that wasn't in direct conflict with anybody. They were seen as like separate but equal.
But Ben Klassen says that all Chinese civilization is white.
Well, that's the difference that you see between
Yes.
whatever fucking Christian identity and
Creativity.
creativity. Yes,
Our brains are truly poisoned
Just
at this point.
fucked. Just so
Yeah, nobody should actually know the differences between these things.
Okay. So Agassiz and Pound also both thought that different races were created separately. So they didn't believe that there's like one human race. And so the one quote from Agassiz is the creation of half-breed is as much a sin against nature as incest is in a civilized community a sin against character. So that's like one of Pound's belief that comes from the Swiss script. So, the culture founding races were the white race and the Chinese race. So they have the will to create culture. Some other races can carry the culture created by these races. For example, as Japanese who were, carrying the Chinese culture. But then
I bet they'd love to.
Oh,
hear
so
that.
interesting.
Yeah.
So they have like an anti-Japanese bias, probably based on like World War II or whatever.
I don't know. They think but they're not they are also semi okay. Like they're able to carry a culture created by someone else. But then there are races that are completely incapable of even carrying other people's culture, and these are like black people. So they are just there to be workers, and their destiny is to serve the culture-bearing races.
Seems like carrying a culture would be a pretty good thing to be able to do that in that case, no?
Well, yeah, that's because that's
almost
why,
ideal, really.
Japanese people are not, not to be slaves. I guess. I mean, I don't know. These people are idiots.
Yes. Yeah. Well. There's
Yeah.
that.
No, I was trying to think of like some, you can't go down that line of argument because it's so flawed, like fatally to begin with. Because it's just like, well, okay, you literally know nothing about. Like,
I mean, that's yes.
You literally know nothing about Africa or like African cultures or African civilizations or literally anything regarding Africa. I mean, it's the same thing when I lost my mind to Ben Klassen.
Yes,
It's like you know so little.
Yes.
About these people that you really, really don't like and have very strong opinions about that. Yeah. Like it's impossible to even just like say anything as a counter argument to that because it's so preposterous to fucking begin with.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, but this is like, I mean, I didn't want to go into this because this was too much already. But while Casper was in his open-minded Nazi phase in Greenwich Village, hanging out with black people, he had some like contact with like Afrocentric people, read some stuff like that, and claimed to be like, that he appreciates African art, culture, music, so on. And he had that kind of thing going on there. And I didn't go into that too much because it's too much for this episode. I mean, already this is too much. Everything is too much. But he also had that. And it's interesting, like, because, you had someone like that. And then, like, a year later, he's, like, burning a cross in some, like, a yard of a house where a 5-year-old black kid lives because they want to enroll her in a school or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're threatening to kill, like, the school's principal.
Yeah. And he was hanging out. Like, they were having parties in this bookstore that included black people. And, like, it was like a...
This is not many years before either, is it? I mean, this is like, what are we talking? Like, between this and Clinton High School?
No, it's like a year before.
Yeah,
like
really?
It's,
yeah. Good Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, I mean, we've seen this kind of thing like over and over, not just in this arc, but even like previous arcs. I mean, we've seen people like hanging out with people that they would later kill.
Yes.
And threaten to kill and do whatever to. I mean,
Yeah. Yes. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. But also, I guess it's normal. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to see that it's normal in America, I guess. In other places, probably.
But I
as
mean,
well,
we're going back to our Balkan arc too. I mean,
Yeah.
we talked about like Ustashas who were cool, that had like associations with certain Serbs, and then like a couple years later, were literally genociding.
Yeah. I mean, most people are not consistent. Like, it's hard to be completely consistent.
Deep thoughts from.
So, the Brown decision in 1954 really kind of fueled the hatred against black people in the South, even more so than it was up to that point, and resulted in a lot of violence there. And for both Pound and Casper, this was a fulfillment of the Jewish communist conspiracy to destroy the white race.
Obviously.
And for both of them, school integration was the same thing as race mixing or mongrelization, as they called it.
Yeah, everything was. Any right that black people got was about miscegenation and destroying the white race.
Yeah.
Through sexy time.
Yes. And, a lot of people in the government at the time basically had the same thought. Maybe they wouldn't express it in the same way, but, J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI at the time, who basically was saying the same things, since 1919, when in some report where he linked race riot, like some race revolts with, Bolshevik influence and so on. So in 1957, Casper framed it like this. The communists were behind all the pressure for desegregation. The commies wanted to weaken America, didn't they? Well, mongrelization of the white race was the quickest way to do that, and integration of schools was the first and longest step toward mongrelization. But, for the two of them, it was obvious that besides that, the civil rights movement was also not only communist, but another manifestation of the Jewish plot. The most recent phase in a long-term plan to weaken the white race through interbreeding with the lesser people, as they saw it.
Do you ever get a sense of deja vu doing this arc?
I mean, yes, of course.
This feeling that we've been here before?
Yeah, absolutely.
Trapped in this eternal return.
They slightly phrase it in different ways, but it's basically the same thing.
Yeah, I can hear Coughlin saying it like 1,000 episodes ago.
So, in 1954, Casper switches from being a neo-Nazi, personally friendly with some black people in New York City, to a sudden racist, anti-black activist and a cross-burner, allied with basically a terrorist. And a leader of the KKK.
He was brought to trial, in fact.
Yes, he said he spent some time in prison. Not a lot. I think less than 2 years, around a year. I'm not exactly sure how much. In 1956, he started his own group of this type, which was called the Seaboard White Citizens Council. This is the group that published the pamphlet that we read. And during all of this time, Casper was very well connected, to the kind of the mainstream to the establishment, basically. He had connections through Pound with various senators, congressmen, and so on, but also to a lot of like generals, admirals, and so on, who were all horrible racists and fascists. Okay, enough with this piece of shit.
Now, the beginning of the end, right?
Yes. So for Casper, it was very stressful and difficult to operate this bookstore in New York City. He worked there alone. He was tired, exhausted. All of his Nazi friends were, horrible pieces of shit.
Nazis.
And the only reliable person was this black lady who later in life, as we heard now, become a historian of, oppression of black and native people in America. So he was not having fun. And in 1955, he decided to move to Washington, D.C., and to start operating a bookstore there. Part of this motivation to that was to, for him to be closer to Pound, because St. Elizabeth was in D.C.
Okay.
So a guy who was very helpful for Casper in his move to Washington, D.C. was a guy called Robert Furries. And I mentioned him because he was a lawyer from D.C., who was also an extreme racist. But he was also a founder of a group called We the People, and this was a kind of a precursor of Liberty Lobby. And this guy Furnace was a connection between Ezra Pound and Willis Carto. So Pound also had a connection with that guy as well.
Okay.
So when he moved there, Casper and his circle of friends, they printed a kind of a catalog of recommended books, recommended by Ezra Pound, which was called Make It New Summary. So among the recommended books in the catalog was Mein Kampf and also the Protocols of Elders of Zion. But
Lovely.
so this is now where, where was this?
That's what Pound meant by the classics.
Yes.
Oh.
You know where this catalog was printed?
Oh, man. Is it guessable?
I mean, it is kind of ridiculous, so you can probably guess it.
It's not something from a previous episode.
It was not printed in... this is a clue.
Was it the U.S. Congress?
Yes.
Ha!
Oh, shit.
George the Addict's ghost is back. I knew he'd come back.
It was printed in the basement of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C.
Wow. Okay.
So, yeah.
Man.
They had some friendly connections there, so they printed in U.S. Congress.
Can I just say how fucked up it is that was my first guess and it was true? And how fucked up that means for America and for just everything.
Yes. So, yes. Because the way it was printed and how it looked, Marsh kind of thinks, he's not sure, but he thinks that maybe this means that all the Virginians on guard was also printed in U.S. Congress.
I mean, why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
So,
if anybody wants to hear, by the way, about how George Viereck turned the Congress into a Nazi printing press, America First episode.
So, the bookstore that he bought in Washington, which was called Cadmus, I think was renamed Make It New. And for a time it coexisted with the Greenwich Village bookstore, but then he closed it because he couldn't find anyone to run the New York bookstore because they were supposed to run it for free because there was no money, so no one wanted to do it. Yeah. And so, okay. So while running his new DC bookshop, Casper met a person that he knew of from before, and this was this horrible racist piece of shit called Admiral John Crumlin. He met him in the winter of 55-56. He was an admiral. He was a Southerner from Alabama. He was a McCarthy kind of activist, anti-communist. Right. He stood for racial apartheid and white supremacy. And Casper took this Crumlin guy to the hospital to meet Ezra Pound, and Pound was very pleased when he met him. He said Casper found a really great admiral for our cause and so on.
Sorry, I just love that they're like constantly parading a bunch of like people into this like mental hospital in DC.
Yeah,
to like meet Ezra Pound.
He's meeting people there all the time. Like it's
Was there like a nurse Ratchet there? Like, what was going on in that hospital? Like,
I don't know, but it seems that he was freely able to socialize with whom he ever wanted to.
I mean, I guess since it's in DC, it's pretty easy if they wanted to, if they cared, to keep a nice list of everyone that went there.
So Crumlin, after this, decided to run in the upcoming Democratic primary for Senate in Alabama. And Casper left for Alabama to join his campaign under the direction of Ezra Pound. He was always in contact with him. So Casper became Crumlin's, campaign staff, but also his chauffeur, his errand boy, whatever he needed. And in that campaign, he met another racist called Asa or Ace Carter, who was like a radio guy from Birmingham, Alabama, and was also the leader of a Ku Klux Klan group called the Original KKK.
The OKKK.
Yes. Yes. So Crumlin was also like an anti-Semite in his campaign. He claimed, the campaign against segregation was led by the Jews. He even named the Jews who were leading it. Like it was like some Senator Lehman, he called a Marxist Jew. And he was saying things like, we got to keep this last frontier of the real Anglo-Saxon race or something like this. So it was very, Anglo-Saxon oriented campaign. So it's interesting that this campaign at some point was joined by George Lincoln Rockwell, who met Casper there and contributed to the campaign by his crude racist cartoons, and then Casper sent them to Ezra Pound. So he's also part of the story. And Pound was, the whole time he was sending like suggestions, like the possible talking points for speeches, slogans, and so on to Casper to be used in this campaign. And a lot of these ideas, if you want to call them, that were later used in the Virginians on Guard pamphlet that were used first in this campaign.
Lovely.
What was their party called? The
Democratic Party.
Ah.
This was the primary.
The Democratic Party, yes.
Yes.
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So on June 4th, 1956, Casper called a conference to announce the formation of his own group, the SWCC, the Seaboard White Citizens Council in Washington, D.C. And as I said, unlike the other chapters of the White Citizens Councils, this one even didn't allow Jews to be members. And I think Boris made a comment on this before when we were reading the pamphlet. Their motto was, "Honor, pride, fight, save the white."
Yes.
And so it was not white race because white is supposed to rhyme with fight.
Right.
And this later became the motto of the National States Rights Party, of which Casper was one of the founders.
Damn. Yeah. It's weird knowing that Ezra was like down there underground the whole time. We were covering these things. He was somehow hooking them all together out of our view.
Yeah.
Just sitting in a fucking mental hospital.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Like meeting with people, corresponding with people. Just
I mean, Ezra Pound is like, it's actually a pretty good way to end this arc, I would say.
Really coming together here.
Yes.
yeah, right.
So
When's the boon coming?
Well, I don't remember the boon. Yeah, he was in connection
We
with
got the Italians down.
Yeah. But so in 56, Casper sold the bookstore to a friend, although he worked there occasionally. So right about that time, the crosses were burned at the lawns of those that the racists saw as responsible for the Brown decision of the Supreme Court. So in July of 12th, 1956, the federal district judge John Paul, who was the son of a Confederate soldier, actually ordered the desegregation of schools in Charlottesville, Virginia. And 2 nights after that, these crosses were burned at, for example, the yard of the Chief Justice Earl Warren and other people connected to the Brown decision. So this decision by John Paul made Charlottesville the target of the Casper's next raid into the South.
Interesting that we got Charlottesville again.
Yes.
Yeah. Another callback to the first arc.
So the cross burnings happened on July 14th, and on August 4th, Casper left for Charlottesville. Some time in between, he printed the Virginians on Guard. We know this because, as we saw, the pamphlet included the photographs of these cross burnings.
Right.
I just mentioned.
Yeah.
But what's also interesting is that some of these cross burnings, the photographs were never published in the media or the newspapers or anything like that. So Marsh thinks that people connected to Casper or Casper himself made the cross burnings themselves and photographed it for this pamphlet. So it was basically part of the same campaign. You do the burnings, then you photograph it, and then you include it in the pamphlet.
Right.
And then
I don't know. Maybe they
Yeah.
thought National Geographic was going to come to town,
Yeah, sure.
It's funny, like Charlottesville's not a big place, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of these places are like very small. I mean, much smaller than Charlottesville that he went to. So August 18th, there's a meeting in Charlottesville called by his group, the SWCC. It drew less than 120 people to the McIntyre Park, but they, when they prepared the meeting, they distributed these leaflets that announced his speech there, and it said, "Here in person, John Kasper, segregation chief." This is how he presented himself. So on August 23rd, the SWCC burned a cross outside of the Westminster Presbyterian Church because this is the place where the local chapter of Virginia Council on Human Relations was meeting. And Casper, during this, shouted to the church, I guess, "We have declared war on you. We are going to run you out of town." This is basically, but remember, this is a guy from Jersey
Yes.
who just came to Charlottesville, and now he's running these people.
I mean, this is literally the outside agitator.
Yes, exactly.
But in this case, it's some guy from the north that's going to the south.
From fucking Jersey.
Yes.
Yeah. Some guy from Jersey is going to Virginia and being like, made a pamphlet being like called Virginians on Guard.
Yeah.
And then is like speaking in the name of Virginians about how a Virginian should act. And
he wants to like
not that there was any shortage of Virginians that were, segregationists or whatever, but it's very funny when these kind of fucking dudes take the lead. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And he wants to run out some like local Presbyterians from the town.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this is their version of that go to the people movement of like early Russian anarchist communists,
I guess so, yeah. Go to the people to terrorize them.
Exactly. Go to the people and terrorize them. Yeah.
Yes.
Without the fun like literacy film trains that those go to the people guys had.
Yeah.
So Casper and his racist friends continued this cross-burning campaign in Charlottesville almost weekly, terrorizing people there. They distributed the Virginians on Guard to all the local politicians and then to also Virginian like state legislators, to all of them. And this resulted in the judge Paul suspending his ruling that he made earlier. So the desegregation of schools in Charlottesville was postponed indefinitely, directly as Casper's activities, terrorism. So it was continued, this desegregation, in 1959, when 12 black kids enrolled in a school there with 1,200 white kids. So
this put a pause to it for what, 3 years then? Something like this?
Yeah.
Damn.
That's not like insignificant. I mean, that's
no.
So in 1956, Casper was active in Clinton, Tennessee. He moved his operation there because a school in Clinton was supposed to be the first integrated school in the nation at that point. So this became a big crisis, and a part of it was very present in the media. You had Casper on the front pages of Washington Post and the Times magazine and so on. Clinton at the time had 4,000 citizens, out of which 220 were black. So, okay, this is one of the worst things he did there. At this point, I kind of lost my mind, so my notes are less detailed now.
I think you should just read them verbatim. I'm really curious.
And they include more and more like insults and slurs.
It looks like the first page of Virginians on Guard, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's lots of capital letters, handwritten.
Yeah.
With
do you give any presidents nicknames?
No.
Pure racial slurs, I'd imagine.
Do you quote the fourth dimensional ghost of Ben Franklin? That's important.
I don't.
Well,
so,
what are you doing then, Ray?
What is this?
Well, let me try and tell you. So, I mean, he went there and he did horrible things. And first, when he went to Clinton, Tennessee, they immediately started, cross burnings and like terrorizing the local black population, like they were doing in their yards. Then he was doing a house-to-house door knocking campaign, distributing, Virginians on Guard.
To people in Tennessee.
Yes,
Good
He was-
strategy. Yes.
Yes, he was arrested a few times. I didn't keep notice like exactly when he was arrested and so on. He was mostly let
It was
go.
after that little mini riot.
Yeah, but he was arrested a few times
Ah.
and then kept like one night or a few hours in jail.
Okay.
So on the 27th of August, 12 black students, like children, started going to a school with that had 700 white kids there that enrolled on that day as well. The day these kids enrolled, Casper was let out of jail, or he was cleared of some charges, and he immediately out of the courthouse went to these schools and started threatening the principal there, making a big fuss. And by the end of the school day, there was like a large crowd of racists surrounding the school. So these 12 black kids were harassed as they went home. Casper delivered a speech later that evening to a few hundred people. And in the next days, this became more violent. So these black students were attacked. Again, he was like briefly arrested. He was served a restraining order by a U.S. Marshal. But then Casper and a mob of 300 racists started threatening it. One day, these black children, while they were going towards home. So, you have a mob led by this maniac who are threatening these kids, some which were like small children.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong too, but the National Guard wasn't involved in this at all, right? It was just local police, like the same guys that let John Kasper out on the day of the.
They were involved, but not at this point.
Okay.
So they were harassing these children. Then they started attacking black people all over town. By the way, at one point while he was in jail, he wrote a text called "Segregation of Death," and then later it was published in a journal called Virginia Quarterly, right next to a text by William Faulkner. So this is like,
wow.
this like
Okay.
person terrorizing like small children, was being published. Yeah. So on September 26th, they started a bombing campaign. So dynamite, was exploding all over the town next to the houses of these black people whose kids were going to school. On one occasion, one black father ran out of his house that, bomb exploded next to with a gun in his hand, and then he was arrested for carrying a weapon. Some of the
fucking goddamn it.
Yeah.
America's insane.
Yeah. So some newspapers, reported it like, bombs exploded and so on. One black armed Negro arrested. Something like,
for bombing his own house, obviously.
Yeah, basically implying that he was responsible for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you get your house bombed, you come out with a gun,
yeah,
and you get arrested for it.
Of course. Well, you can't just walk around with a gun. So
this is the South.
Yes.
We have very strict gun laws here.
So a restaurant was bombed with 12 sticks of dynamite. A woman, a baby were wounded there. 30 houses were damaged. There was at least 8 or 9 bombings in Clinton.
30 houses were damaged?
Amazing.
Yeah. And that's a lot. That's a lot of houses. I mean, that's to damage 30 houses. I mean, I guess, yeah, you're using dynamite. This is significantly more violent than, one would, be led to believe by reading like official narratives of this. I mean, like when you're talking about like that, like 30 houses being damaged, what does that mean? It means that like you have huge explosions going off. This isn't like,
Yeah, some of these explosions were huge, yes.
This was all notably absent from this primetime news documentary of the time about the Clinton events.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
John Kasper, however, was not absent from it.
Yeah.
They gave him something like 10 minutes of speaking time. Yeah.
So at some point, the National Guard troops, National Guard of Tennessee, supported by tanks, enrolled in town. I mean, this like harassment continued after that, and it kind of the peak of it was when on December 4th, a prominent minister like Reverend Paul Turner was beaten and bloodied for escorting 6 black kids to school. We talked about that a little bit. He was attacked by Casper's followers, but people that Casper brought to the town. That kind of made them, I guess, the bad guys there, finally. I think they beat up priest.
Generally not a very good look, yeah.
And also got beaten on a little bit by a priest, which is also pretty embarrassing.
Yeah. In a third kind of like the last phase of this shit they were doing there, actually Casper formed a racist group of school children, like 40 of them that he recruited just to harass black kids in school, which they did. And later they admitted that they were actually paid to do this. So one boy said that he was paid $40 to beat up a black boy and such things. I mean, pretty horrible stuff. And yes,
God, these people are all such fucking monsters.
Yes, I mean, and not only like as you said, outside the agitator, but like actually like paying people to agitate and to beat people, and like everything that they said, communists do, they did.
Yes,
but in the worst possible, most disgusting.
Yeah, but
way.
to children.
Yes, to children.
Yes. All right, guys, hear me out. You know all those tactics that we made up that Jews and communists are doing to America? I think we should do those same things, but to kids.
Yes, yeah.
To children.
But listen to this, like 2 years later, in October 1958, this school was like completely destroyed, like by dynamite.
I think three bombs, right?
150 sticks of dynamite.
Good God.
Damn.
The whole school was completely destroyed. And by some miracle, no one died, but also no one was ever arrested for it. And, Casper and his people were probably the people who did it.
So Ezra Pound, lovely poet. We all love his artwork. Wow, what a genius.
Yes.
Great guy.
Yeah. A heroic figure.
Really, truly.
Such a brave man.
Misunderstood. Really misunderstood.
I really love a guy who writes in all caps sometimes and doesn't in other times.
Whose sentences go on for 3 pages.
A brilliant mind of poetry.
Yeah. Okay, I will finish this soon, promise. So, there's a whole page, the whole chapter that I kind of skipped because this is already too long, about called Casper Exposed. And so this is how, Casper was very embarrassed by what the media wrote about him, and this created a lot of problems. For him.
Who was klansman who burned crosses and bombed children.
No, he was, how he was exposed? He was exposed as a person who had black friends.
Oh my God.
And this was like a huge embarrassment for him and created a lot of problems in his terrorist career at the time.
Oh.
And so a lot of people renounced him and were kind of, he's like a, an agent provocateur or whatever and so on, because some newspapers wrote about how he had this bookstore in New York City, which was frequented by black people and had black friends and so on. So this is him being exposed. You see, like you all believe he's this honest person who's terrorizing small children, and now we hear he had black friends.
The betrayal.
What are we supposed to believe?
Yes.
Good God.
Yes. So okay,
it's almost as if that like he led one life in New York City and then decided he would,
whistle Dixie.
Well, play out his fantasies in the South as a pretend Southerner.
Yeah.
Yes. As a child terrorist.
As somebody who claimed to speak in the name of Virginians, for example. A state where he had probably never set foot in until he wrote that fucking pamphlet.
I don't remember the paid child soldiers being part of that pamphlet.
No.
Probably the fine print.
Yeah. We missed that part.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm finishing this shit now. Hopefully, very soon. There was also, like, in 1957, he was active in Nashville. That year, the school integration crisis moved to this city. The whole thing was about trying to integrate, I think, less than 15 children in the first grade into 5 schools.
Damn, America's a fucking toilet. No.
Yeah, it really is.
Yes. So the thing that he did in Clinton postponed integration for 1 year in Nashville, but now it was going on. So they decided to do it gradually. This is why it was only first graders and only such a small amount of children, because of what happened in Clinton. And
or because they thought first graders were disposable,
Yeah. So at first it was like 15 children who were registered to integrate, but then Casper started visiting all of these schools where the children were registered to be enrolled, and made inquiries about who they are, how many of them are. So some of them just withdraw their like enrollment because they were like this crazy terrorist person, going around to schools and seeking information on these small children who are about to be enrolled in the first grade.
Yeah, not a good sign. Red flags.
So he also, classical stuff, cross burning, so on. So he addressed a meeting in front of the Capitol building there. I wrote down the page. This probably means I'm supposed to read something horrible that he said, probably. Yeah. So he, in this speech in front of the Capitol building in Nashville, he said, "The Constitution of the U.S. gives you the right to carry arms. If one of these N-words pulls a razor or a gun on us, we'll give it to them. When they fool with the white race, they're fooling with the strongest race in the world, the most bloodthirsty race in the world." So,
bloodthirsty is definitely correct.
Yeah,
strongest. Yeah. I'm kind of a little bit skeptical here because they seem to be pretty weak in the face of miscegenation.
I mean, when your objects of terrorist violence are kids, it doesn't show a strong
children
appearance.
Yeah.
We are stronger than any 6-year-old.
A sign
if
of
not
defeat.
5-year-olds. Yeah.
So after this meeting, a few hundreds of these assholes moved like close to these schools, and they rioted there. Buildings were set on fire. Crosses were burned on the lawns of black people living there. And at 12:30 at night, a home of one 5-year-old girl who was registered. At 12:30 in the evening, a school where one 5-year-old girl was registered to, enroll, was a whole wing of that school was completely shattered by dynamite. So this finally kind of discredited the segregationist in Casper in the town, who was after that seen as terrorist.
Oh, that was the line. Okay.
Yes. So Casper was arrested after this bombing a few hours later.
You know what they say? Terrorize once, shame on you. Terrorize twice, shame on me.
Yes. So, I mean, this was like September 8th, I think. He was released on September 12th, and on 21st September, he was already at St. Elizabeth's talking to Pound about what he did and, bragging and so on.
Unbelievable.
And on that meeting, they decided to start a political party, Pound and him, which was called the Wheat in Our Bread Party.
The Wheat in Our Bread Party.
The Wheat in Our Bread, which was, of course, Pound's idea. The Wheat in Our Bread Party.
Weeb.
The Wheat Party.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Fine.
Now, we workshopped it.
We've gone this far in this fucking arc. We got the Wheat in Our fucking bread party.
Yes.
of like a Nazi like segregationist like school bomber and a poet that everybody seems to like but that is a complete Nazi shithead.
Yes.
Yeah. One would think they'd prefer white bread anyway, no?
Yeah. I mean, Pound, of course, his idea was to call it the party like this, and it was also because he actually had one of his fixations was about healthy food and so on. It was actually about food.
I see.
Salubrious living.
Yeah.
The Klassen connection.
The Klassen
continues.
classics.
And so this party was one of direct precursors to the National States Rights Party.
Oh, okay.
It kind of later on merged with it, probably. So, I mean, this is the end. Basically, there was like a bunch of other stuff there. I didn't want to go to it because this is already too much. I just want to mention that one of the leaders of this party, or one of the like subgroups of the party, was a Chinese guy called David Wang, who was like a refugee from China, I guess, but he was younger. At this point, he was American, I guess. And he was like one of these sycophants of Ezra Pound. He was like a total like Pound.
I'd imagine like obviously an anti-communist.
Yeah.
Refugee.
No, he was a white racist who's a Chinese, like 100% Chinese, and he was a white supremacist. I mean, one of the leaders of this white supremacist party is David Wang, and he was he often frequented the Make It New bookstore. I wonder if this is why FBI called it the meeting place of Chinese homosexuals. I don't know, maybe because of this guy. In 1958, Casper finally went to like prison. Like I think he was there. I don't know exactly how much, but for a long time. But I think like a year, maybe less than 2 years. And while he was there, the National States Rights Party was founded. But a few years later, in 1964, he was the presidential candidate of the National States Rights Party.
That's nice.
Yes. He died in 1998, by the way. But it was kind of a sad story for Casper because after all of he did for Ezra Pound, and he spent time in jail and so on. After he went out, Ezra Pound didn't want anything to do with him and stopped replying to his letters. Didn't want to see him. And by the way, in the meantime, Ezra Pound was also out of the hospital and moved back to Italy. So and just stopped replying to his.
Well, okay, so this is what I was about to say. So I don't know. We haven't addressed his mental health issue. Just because I don't think it's real.
Yeah.
I did do the like the whole thing about like rehabilitation, political rehabilitation.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like the Western equivalent of that. Like this dude was politically unreliable, and they put him in an institution.
Yeah, that's crazy.
To like correct him, which means essentially that like he escaped any kind of like major prosecution for his treasonous crimes against the state that he was born in and whatever.
And he doesn't sound that he was treated in the mental hospital like a lot of other people would be treated there. Like
this is what I was wondering. Is there a Nurse Ratched? Is there some like it seemed that like the whole time he just enjoyed his time there. He was like communicating with people.
No electroshocks and no lobotomy.
Yeah, like motherfuckers like visiting him.
Yeah.
They're writing like segregationist texts out of the fucking mental hospital. Like he did pretty all right. And then what? He got out of there and fucking moved his ass back to Italy.
Yes. And attended fascist meetings there. Met Oswald Mosley in the 60s there, introduced him at a fascist meeting and so on. And poor John Kasper was not needed anymore. He even went to Italy to see Pound, and Pound didn't want to see him.
Oh.
And, but he did meet, like he had dinner with Pound's wife, Dorothy.
Why do you think that is, though?
I don't know.
Was it like a personal misunderstanding, or he was just like, whatever, I'm in Italy now. I'm European again.
I mean,
whatever.
He probably didn't have a high opinion of John Kasper, and he needed him while he was, in the hospital. It was useful to have such a guy. Now he didn't need him anymore. He was probably annoyed by him.
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, this is it, like, more or less. I skipped a lot of things, but I mean, I don't know. It's I don't know. It's I think some ways maybe, I don't know, the worst story in this arc.
Oh
Maybe.
man, though it really is though.
Well, it's the worst in this arc, and I know we've said this a million times, but it's the worst in this arc because Ezra Pound is a famous poet. He is an important
cherry on the cake.
he is an important figure in like American literature, English language.
I mean, he's required
literature
reading in plenty of places,
like the late 20th century.
Yeah,
and there's no way around that. I think that like the fact that a lot of the level of insanity exhibited by fucking Ezra Pound, like, I mean, like, and not like, you know, okay, yes, he was institutionalized for a long time, blah blah blah. No, this guy was like, from when he started to develop political opinions to when he died, had a pretty consistent trajectory of just the craziest, not like neo-fascist, fascist to neo-fascist insanity. That probably like any major figure in like literature has had.
Yeah. Really, it's really crazy. Yeah.
Who has been like completely, you know, exonerated of that in some ways. Like,
yeah, I mean, like, okay, people know that he was an anti-Semite, and then they usually know that he later was ashamed of it because of what Allen Ginsberg said about him. But do they know that he was like closely connected to these terrorists,
like white,
after the war,
white nationalist terrorists?
Yes,
or that you like, you know,
the fucking Klan.
Okay, like
ANP.
Like after a majority of Italy folded, you went to the Salo Republic and continued to do propaganda. I mean, that's commitment. That's not like, that's not one of these things like, oh, it was the folly of my youth or something.
No.
You know what I mean? It's like, no, you did that.
Yes.
And then you got away. You got off pretty easily. I mean, like, compared to some other like collaborators or whatever, some people liked your poetry, and so they put you in a fucking mental hospital instead of.
And also like this period in 1950s was when he probably did the most damage, you know, because like he was bad as like Italian fascist propagandist. Like he didn't really like the radio program.
Yeah, he barely spoke Italian. Yeah. I mean, like he spoke Italian, but with like a terrible American accent. People thought he was an idiot.
Well, also, I guess they didn't really understand him either, from what it sounds like.
Well, right. Yeah, people thought he was an idiot because they couldn't understand him. And he's just like, I speak Italian. What? It's me, Luigi.
Yes. And now he's actually the leader of, you know, a group of people who are actually terrorizing people, and he's advising them. And like not only, you know, traumatizing and hurting and possibly killing people and small children, but also like postponing the whole integration process by years and so on.
Yeah. So real hero there.
Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, all of us can
fuck ourselves.
To
he's that. I think he's the worst.
Like like Mayakovsky, for example, like you know, wrote some like crazy ass shit and then he like killed himself. And it's like, okay, cool. Like you did some like wild ass shit, and then you're just like
retired in
done.
Italy.
Like fuck this shit. I'm done. I'll kill myself. No, Ezra Pound is I'm too important for that fucking guy.
Yeah, he doesn't even want to die for his beliefs.
Like, it like lives forever. It's like the worst timeline. Of like and people love him. I don't know.
Yeah.
Again, like we've said this before in this, what was it, the 5th episode of this like fucking series. Like, I'm not a poetry person. None of us are like artists and poetry people. I can appreciate some of, you know, his poetry or whatever, but what a fucking schlemiel.
Yes. Also, I mean, like, I think I was surprised. I think this was the only like person that we covered it, I was surprised at how horrible they were. Like, I didn't expect anything good about Ezra Pound, but like this was much worse than I expected.
Yeah,
totally. Most people don't know how horrible fucking Ezra Pound was.
yes.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna start steering the ship towards the ending here.
Yeah.
So let's.
We're done.
Yeah, we're done. Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.